and overthrow the British rule after a certain point of time. And then we got to know a little bit more about this, the university when they were established. It was the four universities that were established. You also touched a little bit upon that, and you talked about Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, I think that was his name, and how first he wrote in English and then he went on writing in his native tongue, which was a political act, which gave us a kind of an understanding that Indian writing in English is not necessarily just to just because of this one particular preference of someone. It can also very well be a political act as well. And the English education system established itself and it influenced Indian vernacular as well. And we got to know that various dialects and uh, books were written, grammar books of regional languages. And then there was a little discussion about nationalism, perhaps I kind of recall that. And we touched upon the topic of translations as well, briefly. That was all I could recall from the last week's lecture.
Right. Good. Anyone else recalls from first two lectures as well, not just the last class?
So we also talked about how the uh, words and their translations are not always exact, and they always have cultural historical implications. Like for example, when we say Indian literature, it actually, although Indian literature technically in India it's kavya, sahitya, and vangmay, right? So that can't be just simply translated and called literature. It is much deeper than that. And uh, and so Indian literature had a lot of um, oral India has a lot of oral literature, whereas Western idea of literature is mostly written. Uh, in fact, the word itself, literature, derives from the word literatura from Latin, which means written, written, work, something like that. And so we talked about all these cultural differences and how problematic and complicated it is to how complicated it is words are across languages and cultures.
Right, very important point that she makes is that the terms like literature, Indian culture, or Indian literature translation, all these terms are modern terms and they come to us through Western knowledge traditions, right? And through colonial enterprise, our exposure to the Western categories of thinking, right? So the idea of literature, Indian, all these ideas are influenced by or shaped by our exposure to the Western categories, right? So when we start thinking of Indian literature at all, means it invariably becomes comparative. And the reason for this is that, yeah, just hold on a moment. Scam. Yeah. So it invariably involves a comparison between two sets of categories, right? Indian and the terms like Aryavrata or Bharatiya or Jambudvipa and so on and so forth. Literature would involve categories, implicit comparison with categories like Vangmay, Sahitya and Kavya, as Tuti was saying rightly. And all these things are caught up in the act of comparison. So it requires comparison to differentiate these two categories, right? So comparison is also for sake of differentiation. I hope you get what I'm saying. If you don't understand what I'm saying, please raise your hand. Good.
So comparison between these words and their implications, right?
That means the idea of literature is a modern idea that has come down to us through our exposure to the Western notions of literature, right? And we compare this with the ideas like Vangmay or Sahitya or Kavya, right? To mark their differences, to understand that these are not completely equivalent categories, right? And in order to find out or discover the differences, right, we need to invariably compare. I hope so comparison precedes the discovery that these two are different set of categories and they belong to different historical traditions, right? So study of Indian literature becomes invariably a comparative act. You cannot study Indian literature without drawing upon comparisons, right? And comparison is not the term that we like. We use the word comparison negatively. Very often, like the word criticism, we use negatively, right? We dislike comparisons, right? And very often our parents make comparison with our siblings, or you compare your boyfriends and girlfriends, or you compare things. And most of the time, it is a kind of evaluative act for showing something is better than something else. So we resist the idea of comparison. But comparison becomes inevitable when we start thinking about Indian literature and itself, because the terms themselves belong to two different historical traditions, right? Writing belongs to the tradition of Western thinking about literature, about le belle letters or literatura, as Tuti rightly points out, and the Indian traditions invariably involve the notion of Vangmaya, or everything that is graced by Saraswati or Vak. And that would involve Shastra, that would involve mathematics, that would involve grammar, that would involve most of the things that are done through words, right? Which involve something of grace of Saraswati. Wow. So you can see that orality, performativity, and are part and parcel of Vangmaya and Sahitya and Kavya, while writing involves a very westernized and restrictive notion of literature. And this difference we are able to make out when we compare. So we compare also to differentiate, right? So this is one of the reasons why study of Indian literature becomes inevitably comparative. And inevitably the question of translation comes up, because you realize the lack of equivalence between the English and Western categories of knowledge and the knowledge subcontinent. And you will mark that I am not using the word Indian, but Indian subcontinent, right? To indicate that the idea of nation is also in similar way a Western category that has been reconfigured and adapted by Indians for their own purposes. And one of the important differentiators between Western notion of nation and Indian notion of nation would be, one, that it's deeply multi-ethnic and multicultural, deeply diverse in terms of languages, right? So French literature will not mark that kind of diversity that you find in Indian literature, because Punjabi and Tamil and Bangla and Marathi and Gujarati and Kannada literary traditions are so different from each other, right? In spite of the fact that they belong to an overarching idea of nation. So this is one, and secondly, the idea of Indian nation is caught up in the politics of anti-colonial nationalism, right? It was a part of anti-colonial struggle. The history of anti-colonial struggle is implicated in the Indian idea of nation. So these are some of the reasons that idea of nation in India and nation in the West are not equivalent categories, right? So we made out this difference by comparison, right? So comparative thinking and the question of lack of equivalence and translations are at the heart of any thinking about Indian literature, uh, study of Indian literature. Does that make any sense? Anything that you want to say about what I have said or ask? Or is it clear?
So what was the first point that you said was implied in the Western notion versus the Indian notion of nation?
Can you
The
come
second
again?
point
What was
was,
the first?
what was the first point that you talked about? Like the second point is about anti-colonialism, and the first
First
point was
point was
ethnic
about
diversity.
diversity of languages and cultures,
Okay.
right? And lack multilingualities that are implicated in the notion of Indian culture and society. So when you think of Indian culture, you cannot be monolingual in your understanding. While the Western categories of thinking about culture are very often monolingual in their orientation. So you talk of French culture, you talk of German culture, but they are very deeply monolingual, right? Which cannot be adapted or used without this awareness in Indian context, right? You cannot think of Indian culture as a homogeneous monolingual space. Uh, I hope you get what I'm saying,
Yes, sir.
right? Any other thing that you have to say about what I have said? The point that I made was any thinking about Indian literature is inevitably comparative and it brings in the question of translation. You cannot escape the question of translation and comparison when you start thinking about Indian literature because of historical reasons. Anyone has to ask something about this? Okay, what else do you remember from other discussion? Very important. Last week's discussion, what are other points that we touched upon? Apart from the ones that Bhavya pointed out about the history of English in India, right? And colonialism, how English came to India. And what was the colonial project of English education, right? And how it was deeply tied up to the question of uh, imperialism or colonialism. And that kind of arrogance can be seen in Macaulay's, what should I say, attitude towards Indian learning, right? He says that one cupboard of Western learning or books is greater than all the cupboards of Eastern literature, right? So you can see that he is dismissing everything that has come up on Indian subcontinent in a very arrogant fashion, as if he has read and learned. And he also argues that most of the books deal with the spiritualism, that it's all about meeting Brahman, Atma and Brahman, Paramatma and Paramartha, right? So it is of no use for secular life, material, everyday life. That is also another point that Macaulay makes, that it has no use in our everyday practical life. It's all philosophy which is high flown and abstract. That's another point he makes. And Macaulay also makes another point saying that the idea behind teaching English, spending 1 lakh rupees not on teaching Sanskrit and Persian classics or Arabian classics, is that we want to create a class of people who are Indians in blood and color, but they are uh, westernized in their thinking and brain. So their brains are English, their bodies are Indian. What do you think of these ideas? Do you think that you can find yourself in this Macaulayan project? Can you relate to this notion? Anyone?
I think it is definitely there in our English is definitely part of many of us, many people, at least in this school. Like for example, for me, I do think in English a lot, whereas I am Indian, and then we can talk about, also we talked about the notion of identity. What is nationality? Is what does it mean to be Indian? And we discussed at length about that. So all of this is quite complicated and at times also probably problematic.
Yeah. And uh, it's not just about thinking in English. It is thinking like the Westerner. सिर्फ हम अंग्रेजी में सोचते नहीं है, अंग्रेजों जैसे भी सोचते हैं. What do you think about that? So we think like our colonizers, but we live like Indians. So that contradiction becomes at the heart of colonial modernity, the kind of modernity that colonialism has uh, brought upon us. So yes, Bhavya, you have to say something.
Yes, sir. Am I audible? All right. It's rather a personal anecdote, and it is very much in relation with the issue that you've mentioned. So, if I have your permission, I'd like to go on forward with it.
But you have to be a bit louder. For some reason,
Uh,
you're wanting. Yeah.
all right, sir. Sir, am I loud now?
Yeah.
All right. So, I come from Dehradun, and my school was an Anglo-Indian school, St. Thomas's College, which was built in 1916, and its roots were deeply British. And you could see the way the teachers would talk. You were not allowed to talk in Hindi. Even sometimes during the Hindi class, the teacher would break out in English and just talk like that. So, and due to these reasons, I could not really understand Hindi or Sanskrit, and I developed a very, I wouldn't say hatred, but I would not be able to score well in them, and I just did not understand Hindi. So I just disliked the subject, and that in turn led me to not engage in certain other cultural aspects, such as getting to know more about the indigenous people of that region, the Gadwalis, and their culture, which is also quite rich. And that just took me towards the Western direction. That just took me towards Martin Scorsese movies. That just made me realize Oscars are amazing. Indian film fare is a sham, and perhaps singers like Taylor Swift are amazing, and Shreya Ghosal is just all right, and many other things, and even the fashion sense. I used to be ashamed to wear a kurta outside my house whenever there used to be a ritual or a havan. So this continued up until the age of 16, and then I had a sort of renaissance, and I realized that I should not be ashamed of who my roots and who I am. I hail from this village and I really should take it up. But by that time, I had so deeply stigmatized these sensibilities in myself. I was unable to relate with my own culture and I wasn't theirs. I wasn't a Westerner. I was just a boy from India. If I wanted to write a young adult novel, I could not at all think about some state, some particular state in USA. I would be from India only and I would not be able to write well. But and I did not even know about India. So this struggle that's out there is actually very real. And in first semester, the way you mentioned about Rushdie and how he felt that he was estranged from his own homeland and he did not belong to any particular place. In a larger sense of things, I think every single student who takes up literature or who writes in English or who writes poetry in English or who's not that good at Hindi, especially the trilingual and the bilingual ones, they are at the end of the bitter end of this deal. And it certainly makes sense to study it now, but sometimes it feels like perhaps it's too late.
Okay, thanks for sharing that very personal experiences. I'm sure many of you can relate. How many of you can relate with Bhavya's story? In fact, I can relate. How many of you can relate with it? What do you say? Harsh, Divya, Divyang, three people can relate. Kagzi, Fiza, yeah. Rushin, yes. Bhargavi can relate. Stuti can relate. So you can see, Bhavya, your story is not unique, right? And if you, yes, Pushti can also relate. So look at this screen that I'm sharing. This is the famous minute by Honorable T.B. Macaulay. Can you see this on your screen? 2nd February 1835. Can you see?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, and this is the minute which decided upon 1 lakh. So 1 lakh rupees is set apart not only for reviving literature in India, but also for introduction and promotion of knowledge of science among the inhabitants of British territory, right? And then he says, this, uh, and I certainly never met any Orientalist who ventured to maintain that the Arabic and Sanskrit poetry can be compared to that of great nations. But when we pass from works of imagination into works in which facts are recorded and general principles are investigated, the superiority of European becomes absolutely immeasurable. And it is, I believe, no exaggeration to say that all the historical information which is collected from the books written in Sanskrit is less valuable and may be found in the most paltry abridgments used at preparatory school in England. Right. So he says that it's as inferior as abridgments used in school, whatever is written in Sanskrit. That's what he says. Then, if you look at this here, I feel with them. I feel with them it is impossible for us with our limited means, by us he means Britishers, right, to educate the body of people. We must at present do best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, a class of persons, India in blood and color, but English in taste and opinions, right? Taylor Swift is better. Taste की बात भी कर रहा है. He is better than whoever you're in morals and in intellect, right? And to that class, we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country. Yes, so that was Macaulay's project. And
And
he
he
goes
was
on to
successful.
say, yeah, and who live in public, they are receiving their, whose education is so utterly useful to them. He is talking of Pandits and Brahmins, because we cannot give artificial encouragement to absurd history, absurd metaphysics, absurd physics, absurd theology. इसके ऊपर पैसे थोड़ी खर्च करने हैं. So that is the project. And another important thing that he points out is that there are people in India like Rajaram Mohan Roy who want English to be taught instead of Sanskrit and instead of Persian or Arabic. That is very important. So it is not that I or Bhavya or Stuti or someone are forced to study in English. Are we? We opt, we choose in some way. There is an agency there. We feel that English is superior to other languages and cultures. And this sense of superiority drives our culture. And we feel it's not just the Britishers, Macaulay, who feels this, but we also feel that Western culture and language are superior compared to others, right? Look at this, right? I have read translations of most celebrated Arabic and Sanskrit words. I have conversed both here and at home with men distinguished in their proficiency in the English, in the Eastern tongues. I am quite ready to take the Oriental learning and valuation of the Orientalists themselves. I have never found one of them who would deny that a single shelf of good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. The intrinsic superiority of the Western literature is fully admitted by those members of the committee who support the Oriental plan of education. Anything that you have to say about this? નથી આવ્યો એમને કેવું ફોલો અપ કરે એ તો હું કરીશ બાકી બધું રેડી હા હા ઓકે ઓકે ખાલી આપણે આપી દઈએ તો સાચું મારે રાઈટ તો can you yes anyone wants to say Macaulay के विचार
yes
बारे
sir.
में
So
and
he
you can
says
see
that
yeah
so
yeah,
he
go
says
ahead.
that theology is absurd, that Indian theology is absurd. Then like what is Bible, what is the Old Testament? Is that not absurd?
वो तो सब महान चीज है भाई right now he can say that
Why
because
do
he
you
is
think they named themselves Great Britain?
pardon yeah my
I
friend,
asked, why do you think they named themselves Great Britain?
Great because sun never set on British Empire in those days, right? फिर सन ने ब्रेक्सिट कर लिया अभी उस उन दिनों की बात है जब sun never set on the British Empire. So the point that I'm making is that comparison can be dangerous as well. The danger of comparison can be of establishing your superiority over others. It can come from the position of colonizers, right? Or imperialist, where you see that other culture is inferior. So comparison के हमने दो एंगल्स देखे एक में जहां इनएविटेबल हो जाता है कंपैरिजन टू distinguish between the categories as they are used here and there, like writing and sahitya, writing or kavya. But comparison can also be used in an imperialist way. So this is also a pitfall of comparison. You're trying to compare to show that somebody is better than others, and this is where we resist comparison. So sometimes your parent may compare you to your siblings to show how better they are. How many of you have heard this from your parents? वो कैसे पढ़ती है देख, तू आलसी है, पढ़ता है देख, right? So comparison can be coming from a place where the ground of comparison, right? Comparison करने के पीछे मकसद वो ज़्यादा important है. यहाँ पे मकसद क्या है? Superiority of the Western literature and culture and language is to be established, and he wants to run down everything that is in the East and the colonized society. That is the intention behind comparison, and it comes from power, right? So because he is in place of power, he can say all these things. So comparison can also comparison has a politics to it, right? Comparison can be political. Okay. So yeah.
So sir, we don't really have a satisfying response to this, do we? Why do we really study English literature? Yes, it is because of colonization, but it's been many years since India has been in quote unquote independent. And we are all educated people here, and yet we still choose English literature over Gujarati or any other. Even though we have Gujarati paper, we have a Gujarati paper, but it's all in translation and everything. No.
So what is the satisfying answer to this? One thing is that you cannot turn history around, but you can be critical of it, right? And we have to be critical. Why are we using English for? We have to ask ourselves, is our need for English and English literature the need to establish ourselves as superior to other people who speak only Gujarati or Hindi or Tamil or Bangla or Kannada or whatever, right? So why are we want to elevate English, right? And there is a paradox here, and the paradox is that English has played, and this is also something that we have discussed, has played a key role in imagining our Indian nation. And the point that I made, but nobody could recall it. How many of you can recall that many of the important leaders, spiritual, political, philosophical leaders after 19th century, like Gandhi, like Nehru, like Ambedkar, like Savarkar, like Tilak, like who can you think of? Subhash Chandra Bose. All these leaders, Jawaharlal Nehru, used English extensively, right? They were masters of English. Vivekanand, Swami Vivekanand. All these great leaders used English extensively, right? So English was important part of their mental framework as well as ours. So what is the place of English in India today? One, paradoxically, English has played a role, right, in shaping intellectual discourses in India. Secondly, English has played a role in standardizing vernacular languages, as we discussed, in the form of grammars and printing fonts and so on and so forth, right? So English has played a role in construction of this nation. Gandhi, who was extremely opposed to English education, himself used to write in English in his paper called Harijan, if I'm not mistaken. So he had a newspaper, English newspaper that he ran, and he was very good with English. So English is important to nationalist thought as well. So that's the paradox of English, and that's what Mount Stuart Elphinstone said when he said that while we are giving them English language and literature, we should start packing our bags. Right. So many of theorists called post-colonial theorists would use the metaphor that people found in Shakespeare's play called Tempest. So in Tempest, you have this magician Prospero who lives on who goes and lives on an island, and with his magical powers he subdues the natives of that island, right? And he has this daughter called Miranda. I don't know how many of you are aware of Tempest. right? So then there is one native who is very different physically, whom he calls a devilish hag, Sycorax, and she has a child called Caliban. Now, all these are because all these natives are his servants. So, uh, Caliban says, I don't know if you've heard this, that I learn your language so that I can curse you in it. Right? I can curse you only in the language that you have taught me. So I learn this language of yours, and that becomes a metaphor or a symbol for colonial experience. And colonialism in this way is very different from imperialism. Because in imperialism, the idea is to rule over other places, right? In colonialism, there is also a project of transforming people's brains, their cultures, shaping other cultures. Right? So this is how imperialism and colonialism differ. So English has a paradoxical place. On one hand, it has played a key role in Indian freedom struggle and nationalism. On other hand, it has the baggage of being a colonizer's language. So this is the paradox that we find ourselves in. Right? Does anyone have to say something about this? I think Pandey Shriji, Harsh Padalia has to. Yeah, Pandey Shriji can start first. Then we can have Harsh. Yeah, Harsh, go ahead.
I would like to just say one thing, a quote that I remember from a film, a French film, The Phantom of Liberty, to conclude this whole discussion that we had just now. So, the as soon as you compare one culture to another culture, it becomes a matter of viewpoint. One is always someone else's barbarian.
Can you be a bit loud, Harsh? थोड़ा जोर से.
As soon as you compare one culture to another culture, it becomes a matter of viewpoint. One is always someone else's barbarian.
Right. Very true. So the idea of barbarian is also relative to the position of observer. Exactly. So according to Britishers, we were not exactly barbarians, but less inferior, culturally inferior to them. And that is because that happens because one is in a position of power, right? While other is at the receiving end of the power. So power and language issue and culture and literature and comparison and translation cannot be separated. We cannot overlook this question of power when we are looking at Indian literature, English, and translation. Right? So the question of power is very important here. Right? So we have been taught to think about literature and culture. Okay, Sriji, doesn't matter. You can not think of culture, literature, and nation without the question of power. Right? So that's the point we have been making. This brings us to the very interesting question of translation, and something that we have been discussing right from the beginning is that we are not studying Indian literature in Indian languages. We are studying Indian literature in English. So we have to first sort out for ourselves, is English an Indian language? That's my question number one. And secondly, no other society probably does it. Chinese literature in Chinese translation या English translation कोई पढ़ता नहीं है. Chinese literature is in Chinese. Mandarin में आता है तो Mandarin में पढ़ते हैं. Japanese literature in Japanese, right? But in Indian literature, we are reading in English translation, and the idea of English, what is the place of English in India has to be sorted out. So one of the positions that I take, right, and not very convincingly even to myself, is that English is an Indian language. How many of you would agree? How many of you would disagree? Bhavya says that yes. Yes, Fiza says that, Bhargavi says that, Divyang says so. Right? Why does why is English an Indian language? Does anyone want to say something on this?
Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
I would just like to take an example of Senegal and how Senegal was colonized by the French. And many people who live there speak French, and it is, I'm not sure if it's given the national status, but this knowledge is coming from the world of football. But a lot of people from Senegal speak French, and like it has that sort of a status, the same status that English has in our country.
Right.
So, and the second thing is that English is a buffer, it's sort of a proxy that helps us understand and interpret and uh, sort of get to know little bit about the ideas in other languages that we would not know unless we learned them. And especially when India is so diverse, it is helpful to have one language that helps us bridge those gaps easily.
Right. And second reason I also see is that 200 years से ये language India में है, and we speak English not as English people do, right? We speak English with Indian accent, right? We speak in English as if it's an Indian language. We don't speak English as if it's a British language. You don't speak English with British accent, right? Ron Weasley जैसी तो आपकी भाषा है नहीं, या हरमाइनी जैसी आपकी भाषा है नहीं, हैरी पॉटर जैसी भाषा है नहीं. We speak it as Indians do, right? Nor do we speak it like Americans, right? So the American English is the hegemonic model today, dominant model of English today. We don't speak it like Americans either, right? So we speak in English like Indians. Secondly, it has stayed in India for 200 years. Third, because it has played key role in Indian nationalist movement, imagining nation. Because most of the great nationalist leaders, including Sri Aurobindo, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, who wrote his first novel in English, Rabindranath Tagore, Tilak, Savarkar, Gandhi, of all people, and Nehru. All these people were formidable, and Dr. Ambedkar, right? All these are such towering figures of Indian national movement that we cannot overlook the fact that they used English, right? And the constitution was also probably framed in English, and they used the template of 1935 Government of India Act for modifying Indian constitution, and they based it on the values of freedom struggle, right? So English constitution also appears in English first, right? And then it's later translated into other languages. The point that I'm making is that English has played an important role in national struggle. And English that we use is Indian because we don't use it like British. We use it with Indian accent. And because it plays a role in connecting diverse cultures, as Bhavya has said, right? You can talk to Tamilian and Bengali and Kashmiri and Marathi using English. So it serves what is known as the link language, right? These are kind of link language in India. And it also is the language of knowledge, something that we cannot overlook. Most of the current contemporary cutting edge knowledge in any field, be it technology, be it medical science, at whose mercy we are today, or any other field, management, I will just attend to this call because it's coming often. Please, 2 minutes, please. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm back for some homework. Yeah. So, yes, there are certain people who are raising their hands. You want to say something, Bhargavi and Baburam Bhai? Yeah,
Sir,
Bhargavi,
so
go
you
ahead.
asked why the English language is to be considered as, the Indian language, as an Indian language, right? So
Yeah,
now we know that the languages are also about, the cultural identities of the people. They shape the culture of a particular country, right? So due to the colonialism, Indian culture was influenced a lot, affected a lot. And so the English language was the ones used by our colonizers, hence making it the language of power. And so that analogy, like language is power, is, it uh, changed a lot of things for us. So
hmm,
now it started shaping the nation, right? So
right,
apart from it being the language of, economic importance and educational importance, it was also because it was the language of power,
right,
because the it was brought by the Britishers. So that
right,
is, if it has influenced us in such a huge scale, it should be considered as an Indian language.
correct. However, that does not mean we should not question why are we studying Shakespeare and Milton, right? Because
No, sir.
people,
That's
people whose language is English, first language is English, and who study Shakespeare and Milton, don't study Gujarati or Tamil or Bangla or Marathi. They don't flock to studying Gujarati like the way we do. There is no spoken Gujarati class uh, or spoken Hindi class in Britain or America. Yeah,
sir, but then
Baburam
we
Bhai, you have to say
colonized them.
something.
So
Yeah. Ah. Yeah, go ahead, Bhargavi. You were saying something.
oh, so because the scale at which Britishers exploited us, it is different for them, right? Even if they, colonized Australia and Canada, but the level at which it was done, it was, when I read a little about Macaulay. So when he came to India, he had this. Uh, what do I say? The concept of education. Like he was a Christian, right? Particularly, but यहाँ आके, keeping aside his Christianity, he believed in, neutrality. So उस हिसाब से he said something like India cannot have a free government, but the second best thing it can have is this,
Hmm.
a good. What was the exact quote? I can't remember it. It can have the was the but she can have the best next best thing, a firm and impartial despotism. So I don't know why exactly he said, India cannot have, because you are ruling us. Of course, we are not able to have it at the moment. So you are twisting and turning, and you are doing everything in your power to make English what it is.
Yes. So the question of power cannot be separated. And look at the political role that English plays in India today, 2021 में, right?
Yes.
People who take up English medium like I did, right? So it's not that I am out of it. Have a certain political advantage. Because they get certain advantage, there is some element of superiority that English makes available to you in terms of power, right? So it becomes a language of social mobility and aspiration that it is today, right? And very often people who are oppressed for thousands of years, like the Dalits, their leaders have often emphasized the need for English. They want English so that, because Gujaratis and Marathis and Sanskrit are very casteist language, so they feel that English can provide them certain mobility, class mobility, which the other languages cannot, Indian languages on the subcontinent. So there is a need that Dalit intellectuals feel for English, right? So something that we have to keep in mind. Yeah, Aaron and Anuya have to say something.
Yes, sir. Sir,
Yeah.
I actually disagree about English being an Indian language. Uh, Basically, because English came from, even though English has now become an integral part of our language system, it is an official language of India. But I still feel that English is here, like it was brought over to our land by some foreigners, right? They didn't belong to our land, neither did English. And So basically, English is like it's a medium that is giving everyone a common language for communication. And because British had colonized over India and they ruled over India, in a way that it is now installed in our brains that English is a superior language and the westernized
Okay, no, I get your point. Because it's brought by foreigners, it doesn't. It has not come up from India. It's not Indian, right? That's what you're saying,
Yeah.
right? So, do you eat potatoes? Have chai? Chai पीती है?
No, I don't.
Potatoes खाते हैं?
Yeah. Yes.
तो potato कहाँ से आए थे? Indian है potato?
I,
Coffee पीती है coffee?
yes, I do.
तो कहाँ से आई ये coffee? Is it
Uh,
Indian beverage or non-Indian beverage?
I'm not sure.
South
Because,
African.
Ghana's coffee.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think.
And potatoes?
I have to look for it, sir.
Potatoes कहाँ से आते हैं?
I don't know, sir.
For example, this thing that I have here is called darwaza in Gujarati, darwajo, and that is a Persian word.
Mm-hmm.
So what is Indian? Potato is Indian.
Sir, it's food. I mean, okay, it came from Peru. Potatoes came from Peru.
It
But
was so.
sir, so potatoes, okay, if we don't say potatoes are Indian, that we say that. But then
So if you eat potatoes, you are anti-Indian. If you have coffee, you are.
how, sir,
So,
how is that relevant, sir? I'm sorry.
No,
but
I am saying if something comes from outside, right, and we have been using it for our own purposes for many centuries, doesn't it
Right.
become our own? ऐसे मैं पूछ रहा हूँ.
It depends, actually. Our own, so
No, potatoes we have made our own. Coffee and tea, ये अंग्रेजी तो लाए. तो पिज्जा भी खाती होगी. Yes, Maitreyi, you want to say something? टॉम वॉल्टर बाय दैट लॉजिक. वो तो बहुत दूर चला गया टॉम वॉल्टर. मैं तो आलू पे बात कर रहा था. टॉम वॉल्टर बहुत दूर गया. Yes, someone is saying Sanskrit originates from Indo-Aryan dialect, which was not Indian at that time. It came from Central Asia, right? So it came from what is today's Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. So Sanskrit भी तो Indian नहीं है. Very interesting. Oh yeah, your point is very interesting. So Anuya, Sanskrit doesn't seem to originate from this continent. So there is a debate and controversy. So I'm not going into that. But I know for sure that potatoes and tea and coffee and pizza and burger are not Indian for sure.
right.
Fan, car भी तो कहाँ बनाए थी इंडिया ने.
So, सर वो तो कहाँ ही बोला कि कार और ये सब हमारा है.
हाँ, तो मैं ये पूछ रहा हूँ, अगर हमारा नहीं है, कहीं बाहर से आता है, अगर हम इस्तेमाल कर रहे हैं सदियों से उसे, तो वो हमारा नहीं होता क्या? ऐसा
But
भी कुछ?
are we claiming that
That's what
star
I'm
is
asking.
ours?
Can we claim? That's what the question. That
So we cannot say that.
Indian
Now,
English is Indian. Huh?
no, I mean, when you ask that, is English an Indian language?
I am asking, is Indian English an Indian language? The
Indian
one that we are
English?
using to talk. Abhi. You're not talking like uh, Harry Potter or Hermione or.
Sir, I don't think we can actually talk like them.
We
Even
cannot, right?
we cannot, because
But we are using English, right? Aren't we?
yes, sir. So the difference actually lies like English language. Even if we adopt English language or any language for the matter of the fact, we can never talk like native speakers of that.
Right.
Right.
But we can talk like native speakers of Indian English, right?
Because that is how people of India speak. That is how we are taught. So
So isn't that Indian? I'm floating that question. And I told you my
the
position.
way
My position is that Indian English is Indian language.
so the way of talking and the way of delivering or accent, let's say, that could be Indian, but in Indian English, I think,
But
you know what we say Indian English, it's actually British English. Just the point is that we enunciate and pronounce each and every letter. That is
see,
what
no
becomes
Britisher
Indian
will be
English.
comfortable understanding what you are saying, right? They will have to stretch. They won't be comfortable. They won't grasp what we are saying so easily as they can grasp their native speakers. Do you agree? Disagree?
Yeah, I do agree on that.
So, Bhavya is saying Indian English is a vernacular. See, now let's come to that very point. But first, let me finish what Anuya, I am our discussion with Anuya. And I will come to that question. Indian English is a vernacular. Yeah, so Anuya, what do you think? Is Indian English an Indian language?
Sir, I would say that in Indian English, uh, it's an accent, it's not a different language.
It's also grammar. ING formulations we use extensively. We also use reduplication, right?
Yeah, return
Uh,
back. Yes.
so there are features, grammatical features of Indian English as well.
Yes. So, yes, okay. Indian English is Indian language.
Ah, yeah, nice.
Yes, sir.
Convinced or just you're saying because I am trying to persuade you? I'm not. I'm just giving you. How do I back up my claim that Indian English is Indian language? You have to come up with your claims. How it is not an Indian language? Why is it not an Indian language? Yes. I don't know. I will have to ask. Probably he did not. I don't know. I will have to find out from him. Yeah, I will do that. Yes. Okay, coming to the word vernacular, right? Vernacular is not indicator so much of language, but the place in the hierarchy of language, bringing us back to the question of power and language, right? So, people who go to convent English medium schools feel that vernacular yani Gujarati, Hindi, Tamil, Bangla. But the language that they are speaking, Indian language, Indian English, is a vernacular vis-a-vis the language of Joe Biden or Boris Johnson. They, compared to their languages, Indian English, the convent English that we use, is a vernacular, right? So vernacular indicates a place of inferiority in a language hierarchy. So vernacular is not so much of a specific language, but a place in language hierarchy, right? So in Gujarati, you will find certain tribal language just being considered inferior, unfortunately, compared to standard Gujarati. The dialects are considered inferior. So if you speak Bangla with in a dialect of a particular region, then it's considered as inferior to the standard Praman Bangla, right? So certain dialects of Marathi are considered to be inferior to the Praman Bhasha of Marathi. So in that situation, those dialects are vernaculars. So vernacular does not indicate uh, a language, but the place of language in a language hierarchy. So English language that Joe Biden and Boris Johnson uses is considered inferior to Latin and Greek. So they are using vernacular. But Indian English is a vernacular to the standard English, right? And Gujarati is a vernacular to Indian English. So language, conceive of languages as hierarchy. So what do you have to say to that? We'll stop with this final point because we are overshot in time.
So that was the very point I was trying to make when I put that thing up there.
All right.
Because I remember so many people in the school time would correct your pronunciation all the time. Like it's not epitome, it's epitome and stuff like that, which really irritates you. And like grammar Nazis everywhere. So people have that tendency to re-evaluate that language and not accept that okay, this is Indian English, this is not the British English or that it is just based on that model. But this
Exactly.
used to happen. That's why I just said that it is a vernacular
We
to
are
them.
using English for our own purposes from past 200 years, right? So Indian English is our language. So that's the point. Yeah, Aaron has raised her hand, but not spoken.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, go
Sir,
ahead.
sir, can I ask you a question that whether we can call Urdu as an Indian language?
Yes, it is. Now, yeah, very interesting question. Because Urdu is also, but can you call Aaron Bangla
Yes.
as Indian language?
Um,
Reverse question. Tamil is Indian language?
sir, yeah,
Huh?
Tamil, sir, Bangla we can call, I think, as an English language because it is a part of
Bangla is
Bengali.
English language? No, Bangla is
No,
what?
sorry, Indian, sorry.
Tamil and Bangla are Indian languages?
Uh, Sir, Tamil is also used in Sri Lanka. So it's a Dravidian language which was formed in India, but
So it is used in Sri Lanka. Urdu is used in Pakistan as well as Bangladesh,
yes,
maybe.
sir, but
So
if
is it an Indian language? Very good.
sir, if we look at the origin of Urdu, like it was brought by the Mughals when they brought the language called Persian with them to India. The interaction of Persian with the local language at that time formed the language which we call Urdu right now. Um,
Correct.
the
And what
emperors
was
like
that local
Akbar,
language was Hindavi or Hindustani. Hindavi is the term used by Amir Khusro in Delhi Sultanate time. And he composed in that language, vernacular language, right? So with interaction between Hindavi and Persian and Arabic, uh, created a kind of Creole or pidgin that was used in camps of soldiers. So soldiers in Mughal army used to speak this mixture like English among themselves, and that produced something called Urdu, right? So Urdu means camp, army ka camp. उस आर्मी कैंप में से पैदा हुई भाषा. So is it an Indian language?
Sir, so the answer to the question is very clear that we can also call Indian English as an Indian language because Urdu was formed in the same way and we call Urdu as an
Very
Indian.
completely agree. And plus, not just that, Urdu is spoken in multiple nations. Maithili is spoken in Nepal, for example.
Yeah.
Bangla is spoken, it's a national language of Bangladesh.
Bangladesh.
Right. After 1971, a new nation was born. It was called Bangladesh. Their national language is Bangla. and Rabindranath Tagore's poem is considered their national anthem or something. So Bangla is the language not just of India, but also to other nations. So you cannot reduce languages to nations so easily, because that brings us to the question of what is nation, right? Consider Punjabi. Are there any Punjabis in the class?
Me.
The Punjabi language is also spoken in Pakistan, right?
Yes.
And Tamil is spoken, as Aaron pointed out, in Sri Lanka as well, right? And so languages cannot be reduced to the ideas of nations, right? So we have to keep in mind that like we can do for French, फ्रांस में बोली जाती है वो फ्रेंच, जर्मनी में बोली जाती है वो जर्मन, ऐसे नेशन लैंग्वेज जो एक फिट मिलता है, वैसे इंडियन नेशन लैंग्वेज फिट नहीं मिलता. Sindhi language is spoken in Sindh as well as India, right? In Pakistan, which is in Pakistan. So 1947 के पहले Sindhi would be part of region, language would be part of Indian nation state. But now there are so many Sindhis here who have come here after partition who speak Sindhi, right? So going back to the whole question of national identity that Stuti was talking about, it's very difficult to find fits between language, region, nation, right? Like you can find in France and Italy and Germany. We cannot so easily find it in Indian context, right? And what we are doing is comparative analysis. So only when we compare the relation between language, region, and nation in countries of Europe versus on Indian subcontinent, you realize कि वो मॉडल हमारे लिए काम करने वाला नहीं है, right? So French literature is literature written in French by French people is quite easily understandable, right? German literature is written by German people in German language, is understandable, right? Japanese literature written in Japanese language, right, by Japanese people is understandable. But same does not apply when we come to the Indian scenario. So we are left with a lot of complicated questions about nationality, national identities, regional identities, because of historical difference from these societies like Japanese or French or German, right? Anything else you want to say?
So just one thing, and like after that, it can all be wrapped up. I wouldn't imagine reading Murakami or Tolstoy in their own native language. So English also helps bridge that gap across not just this subcontinent, but across the whole world entirely. So that's another thing that's a
Exactly.
defining
So
feature
English
of this
is
language.
also a space where it becomes a kind of global language, right? Through which global literature reaches us, like Kafka or Tolstoy or whatever, or most of the literature that you study in English. So English also connects. It becomes the major language of world literature. Yeah, Harsh, go ahead.
I remember, sir, in first semester, probably in first week, we were discussing the same things. So you asked, is English a global language? No, we were talking about this only, and I said English is global language, and you said, is English really a global language? You said no, but now you are saying English is a global language.
No, in the sense that everybody doesn't use English that extensively, right? Or it's not 10%
We weren't
or
talking about a
20%
global
population
language
in
back
India.
then.
Harsh, 10% or 20% population in India can speak English, which means out of 130 crore, maybe 13-15 crore people can speak English. Now 13-15 crore यानी बहुत बड़ा नंबर है, फिर भी मार्जिनल है, समझ रहे हो? दोनों है. 80 करोड़ लोग हैं जो जानते नहीं है इंग्लिश. इस देश में ये भी उतना ही सत्य है जितना 13-15 करोड़ लोग जानते हैं. You get the sense of it.
Yeah, I mean the ratio is obviously
Right.
is small.
So it is not by global language. I don't mean that everybody speaks English.
I mean it's far
Even in
reaching.
India, yeah, it has got linkages that are fairly widespread. But if you go to Germany, you will find it very difficult to get along by just English. If you go to Russia, you will find it difficult to get along by just English. If you go to Japan, you will find it very difficult to get along using only English, right? So there are limits to penetration of English as well, right? That's what I meant when I said no to complicate the idea that as a पूरी दुनिया अंग्रेजी बोलती है, right?
Yeah,
ऐसा नहीं है, पूरी दुनिया अंग्रेजी बोलती नहीं है,
yeah.
right? So that is still a fact. But by global, I mean it has got a reach that has got fairly extensive.
Yeah.
It is not. It is a kind of international cosmopolitan language. Now, if you go to France, then you will find it difficult to get along using just English, right? So English has a reach, but has limits which are also to be considered. We cannot ignore those limits. Biggest language on the internet is Mandarin. ये मत भूलना, not English. है ना? पर उस सेंस में मैंने ना कहा था. यानी आप ग्लोबल लैंग्वेज का मतलब क्या लेते हो उसके पर डिपेंड है मेरा आंसर.
Yeah, even I meant that like English as a global language means English as culture, it has an effect over other cultures.
Yes, it has got certain overwhelming hegemonic presence over many other cultures. Yes, that is true. But if you look at Japanese or Chinese, then it's not like that, right?
Yeah.
Or German or French or Italian. हम जितने अंग्रेजी को सर पे चढ़ाते हैं उतने दुनिया में बहुत कम देश हैं जो चढ़ाते हैं. That doesn't mean English is not needed for business by Japanese and Chinese. They need it for business and science and technology, but that doesn't mean they abandon that language or their language, right? So that is the whole point of the whole discussion for 4 lectures, is that there is something called subtractive bilingualism. Means once you go after English and you throw away everything else as inferior, you discard it. You throw away your Gujaratis and Hindis and Banglas as not good enough, right? And you lose capacities to use those languages. Does anyone agree with me that once you start imbibing in internalizing English, you lose the other languages that you had?
Strongly agree.
Strongly agree. How about others?
I agree as well.
Yes. So in order to address this subtractive bilingualism, we want to bring in another model of English-India relation, which is called additive bilingualism, which means your acquisition or your competence in English and the kind of erosion of your competence in other languages can be halted at least. When you study Gujarati literature in translation, when you study Hindi literature in translation or Bangla literature in translation, it can be halted. Or another model where English and Bangla, English and Gujarati, English and Marathi, English and Tamil can interact with each other in a productive way rather than negative way, where you lose competencies in other languages, right? So English can be used to enrich your understanding of other Indian languages. And that is the reason why we have this paper in the syllabus. That brings us to the ultimate reason for why we are doing it, right? So anyone has to say something about this? Additive bilingualism. यानी आप अंग्रेजी आपका खत्म नहीं होता, मगर आप गुजराती और हिंदी और तमिल और बांग्ला के साथ प्रोडक्टिवली एंगेज कर सकते हैं, राइट? Something that Japanese, French, Chinese, Italian, German cultures are already doing. They are engaging with English, but not at the cost of German, Mandarin, Italian, and French. I hope you get that. So we stop on this note, right? Tomorrow we are not meeting because there are interviews for teaching assistant in various faculties. So I will be busy with that. So you can ask someone else to engage your classes so that time can be used. And we meet day after tomorrow. Bhargavi and Fiza have brought together many of the prescribed texts, and we'll start discussing those texts. Now that you have got texts, right? I prefer to have those in my hand while studying rather than keeping a soft copy, but you can keep a soft copy if you are comfortable with e-books, right? I can't read beyond 4 pages in e-book, maybe because I belong to earlier generation, but you can print out them out as I did. So we'll start discussing the text, but this is the large field under which we will be looking at the texts now, right? So we'll start discussing our syllabus, the set of books, right? Once now that we have opened up this field of deliberations, debates, and inquiries around the term, we have complicated our simplistic understanding of Indian literature, right? Now we can enter the world of Indian literatures. Now that we have established why we are doing this, right? Anything that you have to say before we stop?
What text are we going to start with in the next lecture?
We are going to start with the first unit, Mudra Rakshas, one of the best plays I have ever read in my life. The theme is no longer a romantic comedy that is the staple of Sanskrit plays, but a play about espionage, intelligence, and politics with vengeance, right? So the question of power and politics, espionage, misinformation, disinformation, fake news that before the age of WhatsApp. How fake news can be weaponized, right? Is one of the themes of the play, Mudra Rakshas, right? So it's a 2,000-year-old place, no, 1,300 to 1,400-year-old play, but it looks not familiar to me, right? How to use fake rumors to discredit someone, your opponent. ये तो बहुत कंटेम्प्रेरी चीज है ना? उसके साथ हम स्टार्ट करेंगे. Done?
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So see you day after tomorrow.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Welcome.
Good day.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Bye, sir.
Yes.
Thank you,
Welcome,
sir.
welcome. Yes.